think the one thing that I would just challenge leaders who are thinking about investing in retreats and offsites is to think through, like, what is the actual goal of this gathering, and are we actually going to get something especially incredible out of the fact that we're bringing people together, or have we romanticized that in our mind? And just, if you just ask the question and can answer it honestly for yourself, I think that's a good step in and of itself.
Hi, I'm Rob Sadow, and you're listening to the Flex Perspectives podcast, where we interview the world's best thinkers, researchers, and operators on how to make flexible work work. Flex Perspectives is brought to you by Flex Index, the world's most robust source for full-time, hybrid, and remote work requirements. Flex Index represents more than 8,000 companies, 60,000 office locations, and 100 million people. It's a great place to start if you're looking for your next flexible work career opportunity. Today, my guest is Chase Warrington. As the head of remote at Doist and a member of the Forbes Business Council, Chase is one of the foremost experts on how to implement and optimize fully remote work. In this episode, we dive into how the average Doist employee only spends 2 hours per week in meetings, why well-executed fully remote work should not be viewed as a cost saver versus having offices, and how to break down your time at offsites for maximum impact. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us out by subscribing and giving us a rating. It helps us understand what episodes our listeners find most valuable and helps new listeners find the podcast. Chase, I'm extremely excited for you to be here.
It's great to finally meet you, Rob. Thanks for having me. And looking forward to it.
And Chase, you have to forgive me for my slightly overly nasal voice today relative to my normal voice. I told you I have a 2-year-old and a 3-month-old, and I'm getting over some winter break colds. And so such is the life with young children, I think.
I think myself and the audience can forgive you. As a fellow podcaster, I've been there, done that. I totally understand the battle you're facing. So no judgment from my side.
Yeah, I think I was told that I should just expect until my kids are a little bit older to just be sick all the time, just on and off. And I'm definitely living that over the last several months. It's been a very much a reality for me.
Well, hope you feel better soon.
I appreciate it. So Chase, you work at both an incredibly interesting company, Doist, doing something that's pretty fascinating, and I think a role that is becoming more common, head of remote, or at least somebody who is dedicated to thinking about this topic. You're a member of Forbes Business Council and talk about this stuff on a regular basis. One of the things I was curious to understand is, have you always been into remote work? Like, has this been a thing for you for your entire professional career, or did something happen that kind of like led to this connection with this topic?
I think a little bit of both, actually. So I was always interested in working remotely. Like the thing that sounded terrible to me about graduating, I went to business school, graduated from business school, and I knew I was going to go into some sort of like white collar work, I guess. And I just automatically associated that with a cubicle, which sounded terrible. I liked a lot of jobs that I was looking at coming out of school, but I didn't like the environment that I was going to have to go work in. And so I think, like, from very early on in my career, I thought, like, I should be able to do most of this work remotely, but we're talking, 2007, 2008, 2009, like remote work wasn't really a thing, but I decided to make that my priority when I started my career, and have always worked remotely. I was the most I've ever had to be in an office was 1 day a week for the first 6 months of my career, and ever since then, it's been all about remote. It became more of a passion and a project, something that I could actually work on the infrastructure of remote later in life. But yeah, it's always been important to me to have that flexibility and freedom.
How did you learn it? Because one of the things I'm curious about is I think a lot of people, and correct me if I'm wrong, by the way, Chase, but I would think that a lot of people who are operating in a fully remote capacity largely probably started out spending more time in an office, and over time realized that for personal reasons or the way that they are most productive, or for kind of like other rationales, ended up moving toward remote. But it sounds like, if I understood correctly, that you've kind of always in some ways been operating in a mostly kind of like remote capacity. And so how did you kind of like learn and adjust to that? Or the things that you felt like you needed to pick up after that you didn't get early? Like, how did that happen?
I think it's really funny because I spent a lot of years failing, but I didn't know I was failing. I just didn't realize it until I got to Doist, which is like getting your PhD and working remotely, because it's all we've been 100% remote since the company was born back in 2012, and everybody's kind of a pro at asynchronous work, and and working remotely, we kind of study this as an entity. We look at other companies that are doing this. I have a whole role dedicated to making sure we're doing it well. So Doist does it at a really high level. But for the first half of my career, I spent 7 years kind of failing. I didn't really have an operating system in place. I didn't have a dedicated place that I worked from. I didn't have a real productivity system of any kind, no real rules. I just kind of was winging it. And of course I learned a lot along the way and did fine. But it's really been interesting when you step back and look at remote work as an operating model and making sure that everyone on your team is getting the most out of this experience. There's a lot that you can fail at. I mean, if you're not doing all of those things, you can. I think the worst of remote can be a pretty bad experience, and I've seen that firsthand as well. So, yeah, I think a lot of trial and error, and then ultimately coming to a place like Doist where they take it very seriously.
As an entrepreneur, I'm very familiar with the idea of learning a lot through failure. So I
Yeah,
totally respect and understand that experience. But one of the things that's interesting, as you mentioned it, is you've been doing this a long time. Duos has been around, as you said, I think since 2012. It must be pretty interesting to be in this world and then have spent a number of years where remote work was growing, but still relatively niche, within the
yeah.
broader kind of workforce in terms of number or percentage of people who are working remote. Then all of a sudden the pandemic hits and billion people all of a sudden get exposure to what it means to be remote. What was it like going through that experience and all of a sudden becoming so in vogue, if you will, in terms of a topic or a focus area?
It was fascinating actually, because we went from, not only being one of the few fully 100% remote first companies with no offices, working almost entirely asynchronously. Everybody works from wherever they want in the world, with a few small exceptions. We were one of the only ones doing that. And it was kind of, you were kind of in this small little echo chamber of companies that were doing this. And to take it a little bit further, we're a company that builds products that serve our needs as a remote team. And then we put those out there into the world, hoping that they'll serve others. So on one hand, we were suddenly inundated with a massive business opportunity. And on the other hand, we went from being in this small little echo chamber of companies that were talking about remote work best practices to all of a sudden everybody was talking about this, either from one angle, oh my God, we have to learn how to do this, or from the other, hey, let's share our best practices and tools and tricks and what's working for us. And since we want to be really good at this, like we try to do everything at a world class level. That's the internal line mantra we use. And doing remote at a world class level is part of that, is very core to our company DNA. So that came along with it. We said the game is changing. We want to be at the forefront of that change. Hence my role being developed during that time.
So tell me a little bit about that, and maybe give a sense, because I imagine that some of our audience is familiar with Duos, some may not be. But what's the scale of the company? What type of products do you build? Where is the team distributed? And then tell me a little bit then about how your role started to evolve into that head of remote, and what it meant to become world class in this particular area.
Yeah, sure. So Doist is a software company. We're about 100 people spread across 35 different countries, and those countries span all time zones. So we've been remote first since the company began, and that means we've never had an office. We don't require people to be online or working at any given time. We want people to just truly work, when it works best for them. And to do that, we have to operate almost entirely asynchronously. On average, Doisters have about 2 hours of meetings per week. And nobody reports having more than 8 hours of meetings per week. So it's a very asynchronous first organization, and that's very core to how we have to operate. We build a few. We're most well known for two products. Todoist is considered by many to be the leading task management app out there. It's a lightweight project management tool for teams or as a individual task manager, and it serves tens of millions of customers in 19 different languages around the world. And so we're very proud of what we've done with that tool. It's a very competitive space, and we are often considered the leader in that space. So that's always been pretty awesome. And doing that as a fully remote team, relatively small of 100, with 100 people, is also something I think we're proud of. The other tool is Twist, which is a team communication tool built specifically for distributed teams like ours. It's very focused on asynchronous communication and kind of reducing some of the noise that you might get with other chat apps.
I want to talk for a second about what you said about meetings because I felt like for about 30 seconds my mind was blown in terms of the relative load that you were talking about. I'm going to guess amongst 100-person organizations, the number of organizations out there that only spend 2 hours a week on average per person in meetings is one, and it's yours. If I had to guess, how did you get there, and was it always that way, or was there a concerted effort and set of practices that you put in place that helped drop meeting time? Because I think that's, in my mind, become a bit of um, a negative externality of the shift out of full time in office into hybrid for a lot of organizations or remote has been a huge increase in amount of time spent in meetings and discomfort still with asynchronous work relative to trying to work synchronously.
Yeah, I mean, we live in an immediacy world where people often think the fastest way to do something is the best way, and the only way to do that is to sync up. And when everyone got armed with their Zoom accounts during the pandemic, that meant that working became working in Zoom more or less. And we've always been a very meeting heavy society, right? Like in terms of how we work. I mean, it like you said, it's just sort of the default to think that you're going to spend a lot of hours in meetings. um, there was no inflection point where we said we need to change this. It was baked into the company from early on that nobody really likes meetings. Like not many people show up to them thinking like this is I want to spend 6 of my 8 hours in the office today in a meeting. And so we said, like, is this actually the most productive way to work? And then as we scaled the team and we had people in Seattle, Washington, and Perth, Australia, and Cologne, Germany, and we said, well, these three people can't be on a meeting at the same time. What if we just built our whole system around asynchronous first and used the synchronous meetup as the last resort instead of the other way around? And it's worked really well for us. It has its drawbacks, and there's pros and cons to every decision. And sometimes most notably, it'll affect execution time at times, but the trade-offs are very much so in the pro column as far as we can tell.
So let's talk about that a little bit because I think that's probably a very hot topic amongst a lot of organizations, maybe less in the fully remote camp, but also in the hybrid camp, that are thinking about the balance between synchronous and asynchronous work. How does it affect the ability to attract and engage team across a wide geography relative to productivity and response time? I know one of the things that you've mentioned to me that you're spending a lot of time thinking about is what does synchronous time look like, and in particular offsites and getting people together. And so
Mhm.
when you think about the puts and takes of that, what's working, what isn't working, and kind of how have you started to adjust practices or adjust culture to account for some of the things that you're finding challenging?
Yeah, the way I like to look at meetings in general, whether they be virtual or in person, is that this is like a tool in the tool belt. And I think we have a tendency to overuse that one tool, that meeting tool, quite a bit. We try to use the hammer to solve every single problem. And sometimes you need a screwdriver. Sometimes you need, a wrench. Like you got to pull out these different tools at different times. And so our focus has been on reducing the use of that one tool to as little as possible, and strengthening our asynchronous tools as much as we can in that regard. But when we do need to pull out the synchronous tool, we need to be really good at it. As you said, it's a powerful tool. It's one that can serve a lot of situations better than asynchronous work. And so we have to figure out how to use these tools in different ways and in the right times. As you mentioned, one of them is for us is team retreats. So we've built out a retreat calendar. We have 2 retreats per year, roughly every 6 months. One is an all hands team wide event we call Doist Connect. The other one, we're in the middle of what we call mini retreat season right now. Mini retreats are taking place next month and are each individual team getting together. And kind of oddly, like my role is head of remote. One of the only non-remote aspect of our infrastructure is these team retreats, and it's my job to manage them and make sure that they're pulled off in to a high level. So anyway, I always think that's kind of funny because head of remote handling the only part of the non-remote part of our infrastructure. So Yeah, I mean, we see this as super important. Like remote first doesn't mean remote only, and I think that's one of the big misunderstandings that people have when they think about remote teams.
So let's dig into that a little bit because I think that there's something to be learned from a lot of organizations on the way you execute this. And so if you don't mind, I'd love to hear how did you think about doing it twice a year? One, it sounds like that's more all together, one that's more team based. How do you think about how long that should be, the budgeting around that, the specific content around it? You know, when you think about for an organization that spends an incredibly small amount of time in synchronous work, when you approach those particular moments, how do you do that in the way that's kind of like max effectiveness for your organization?
Yeah, so I'll tell you where we've landed with this, and we've gone through many iterations. We do a lot of feedback loops to gather what teammates want more of and less of and such. And so where we've landed on the right number for us is two in-person events per year that are totally optional. We have a handful of people who just it's not their thing, you know, and we don't force people to attend these. But for the most part, for those that do attend, we end up with around a 95% satisfaction rate. So people really do enjoy these. They're great for team connection. They're great for building deeper rooted relationships and bonds and actual friendships at work, which are all very important for the bottom line. Um, and obviously improving retention. So these are all things that we think are okay. There's a definite reason to do these from a business standpoint. We end up spending around $4,500 per person per year on the events, so spread across the two different retreats, and we've landed on 4 days is like the perfect amount of time, 4 full days together. So usually people arrive on a Sunday or Monday, and we have Monday evening together, then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then departures on Friday. And so if we can get that time together twice per year for around that $4,500 a year cost, then we feel like we're getting a really solid ROI on the investment. The second part of that answer to answer your question is how do we use this time together? You know, what should be done during this time? And so we've kind of come up with this formula, which we call the 20-30-50 rule, which is 20% work, 30% activities, and 50% sort of like what we call R&R, free time, for serendipitous conversation. And so we've actually formalized that and try to stick to that with our agendas. And we think this is what maximizes the return.
Now, there's so much there I want to dig into. Trying to think about what order even I want to go in. I think the first thing that you said that was really interesting to me is that it's optional, you know, and that you
Yep.
don't require employees to go to these offsites. How does that work in practice? Is it comfortable culturally? The idea that some people may not want to do that, and is there any kind of stigma attached to not going? I imagine that there's a different set of relationships maybe that form between the people that get to spend time together in person, or maybe not, you know, versus the people who don't get to do that. How has that kind of worked or evolved at Doist over time?
The way we looked at this was it's very tempting to more or less require people, even if you don't say it outright. It could be, you know, sort of implied, or it could be that you feel like you're missing out on some, you know, some part of your career trajectory if you don't attend these sorts of things. And we really wanted to remove that. So we're very explicit about like these are 100% optional. There's no strings attached if you don't show up, no guilt, you know, no worries. We want people that want to be there to really be there and to show up and enjoy it. And if there's people there that feel forced to be there, then that kind of pollutes the situation for everybody, I think. So we've been very explicit about that, and I think it also stems from the fact that we don't even require people to show up to virtual business meetings, you know, like work meetings when we have a team meeting or something. Like we also make those optional because again, we're working um, predominantly asynchronously. We don't want people focused on having to attend meetings and having to build their life around attending these things. So for some people, it's purely like it just doesn't work for me at this stage in life right now. I've got young kids. For other people, it's, you know, I'm traveling all the way from this place to that place for 4 days. I hate jet lag, whatever it may be. Um, so yeah, I mean, the thing is like we want people to enjoy them, and we want this to be a positive experience for everybody. And if it's not a positive experience for you, then there's no harm in you staying back.
So you do it in a broader cultural way, it sounds like, where it's not just about the offsites, but it's about optionality around on most types, it sounds like, of synchronous meetings. And
Yep.
by doing that, or company wide or team wide synchronous meetings, and as a result, that allows for a little bit more comfort around not attending in person,
Yeah.
if I understood
Yeah.
correctly.
Yeah, you nailed it. Like we want everyone to be able to craft their perfect workday. We say this often, so it's part of the reason for investing so heavily in asynchronous work is we want people to have control over their entire workday and work when it's most convenient for them and their families and their energy levels and all of that. And so it's very easy to extend from that baseline to apply the same approach to the in-person activities. Now, the people that don't go, I do think they miss out on a great opportunity. And you know, a lot of, I would say 9 out of 10 times when someone doesn't attend, it's like, you know, it just isn't conducive to their life at that time. But for some people, it's purely like, I'm just, you know, I'm very introverted. These kind of things are painful for me. I just don't want to go. And so, you know, for those people, we're happy to let them sit out and spend that week invested in something else for the team.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. I want to go back to one other thing you said around the budget, which I think was really, really interesting. Before I go there, one question I had in terms of something that Doist does is the expectation for Doist employees that they work from whatever location they want to on their own dime, or does Doist invest in remote setup or in co-working spaces or anything like that to create third spaces, so to speak, that employees can work from?
Yeah, so we offer a couple different perks to support people from like a home office standpoint. So one, will pay for your co-working, no questions asked, whatever it costs for you to have the place that works for you. That's completely covered by the company. And then we also provide biannual stipends to upgrade your home office, the ergonomics, whether it be getting a new laptop or a chair or, you know, new desk, whatever you want, whatever will make your home office experience better. We'll provide funding for that. We also provide a couple other perks that incentivize meeting up with teammates like on your own. So even if we don't organize it as a team, we'll subsidize the cost to bring you and a teammate together to do a co-working session or go surfing for the weekend, whatever you want. Anything that will help create a bit more connection in this, you know, very distributed environment.
That's awesome. And I think that there's the reason why I was so interested in that, beyond just to understand the Doist practices specifically, is, if I think about the rough math of it, you spend $4,500 roughly an employee. And, imagine that in real estate terms. If you had
Yep.
an office and you had, let's call it 150 square feet, per person, it means you'd be spending $30 a person a year. If
Mm-hmm.
I took that offsite kind of like travel and et cetera budget and put it into real estate, plus there's co-working, plus there's that home investment. And so it's really not a cost savings. The goal
No.
is not a cost savings. It's an operating model, and it's a focus on, this is a way of working, and we still focus on getting our people together. To me, that's important because I think a lot of people look at fully remote work and they think, okay, this is more financially advantageous than having
Yeah.
big leases, et cetera. But in reality, when you do it correctly and you invest in the right way, it's not the cost savings that actually generates the value. It's a different set of value points that feels like they come out of that.
Yeah, you nailed it. I couldn't say it any better. Everything that we may save in terms of like being a remote team versus in, you know, a team that has an office in Silicon Valley or something, we reinvest that right back into the company, into making remote work at a really high level. So these offsites and retreats and gatherings are one part of that, but as you said, it's like the whole operating model that has to be continuously optimized.
Yeah, I think it's the companies that fail to make that investment and assume that, okay, I can save on office space, and as a result, this is going to be cheaper for me in the beginning and over the life cycle of the company, are probably the ones that are going to sub-optimize and not
Yeah,
get
that's
this
it.
right in a way that actually allows them to operate the right way.
Yeah, you nailed it. It's like, to me, it's like buying like a old beater car instead of like, you know, maybe a newer one, because it's going to save you a little money on the front end, but the pains that you're going to have to deal with down the road like probably don't make sense financially or from like a stress and output level.
Yeah, totally makes sense. I want to go back now to one other point that you made that I think is really interesting, and how specific you were around the way you allocate time at
Hmm.
offsites and the percentage of time that goes to different activities. How did you get there? Was it through trial and error, or did you survey employees and try to figure out how they wanted to spend it, or just looking at common themes of things that were successful at different offsites versus ones that were less successful? Like, I'm curious how you got to that formula.
Yeah, this is like a lot of things at Doist, and I'm sure many other companies, is an iterative process. We started with a V1 of something years ago, and continuously improved on it. Gathered lots of feedback, and tried to land on something that was concrete and that would work for us year over year. And so one thing that we noticed, and another thing I'll add to that is I talked to a lot of leaders in this space. Just what are other people doing, what are they seeing, what's their experience like. And there was a common red thread that I noticed both in our retreats and those of others, that there's a huge emphasis on this idea that if we're going to spend all that money to bring people together, all the time out of the office, the lost productivity, we better get something like really productive out of this meeting, which I don't argue with. Like we should, but that doesn't mean that spending 75% of your time sitting in a conference room is the best use of that time, just to produce something that will make you feel good about the investment. So often what I found is we're a team built to be hyper productive in an asynchronous remote first environment. Then you bring us together for 3-4 days twice a year and expect us to be really good at in-person meetings and getting things done. And we would often find like we're sitting in these sessions, but we're not actually getting a ton out of them, and probably just as much or maybe a little bit less than if we had done these activities remotely and asynchronously. So we just recalibrated on that. Like, why are we spending all this time and energy and money to bring people together to do something subpar compared to how we could do it normally? What if we inversed this idea and thought about it as, hey, let's use this time to really focus on the thing that we can't do so well in our typical environment, which is building really strong connections. And I think that's why, like, the company decided, we did this very democratically. The company decided to name our all hands Doist Connect, and the emphasis on connection there, I think, is really important. So we've recalibrated on that, and that's how we spend most of our time. When we do work and when we do try to produce something, it's hyper focused, it's really well done, thought out, and planned ahead of time, and we get something from that experience. So that's kind of like the how we arrived there, but yeah, over many years.
And do you think that that's the right answer for all organizations? Is it the right answer for fully remote ones? And the mix of that should look different if you're hybrid versus full time in office. Like sometimes I know it's a little bit hard to extend what you do and say, okay, well, where does that break? But I'm just curious if you think that's the right recipe more broadly, or if it should be tuned a little bit based on the working styles of the organization.
I think it has to be tailored to the organization and the season that organizations in. If you're pulling people together often for sprints on, you're working on something that's very very young and needs to be massaged quite a bit. I mean, maybe your emphasis needs to go from 20% to 50% on using that time together to do that. And there are people that have very differing views on this than I do, and I respect the differences of opinion. This is what's worked for us, and I think the one thing that I would just challenge leaders who are thinking about investing in retreats and offsites is to think through, like, what is the actual goal of this gathering, and are we actually going to get something especially incredible out of the fact that we're bringing people together, or have we romanticized that in our mind? And just if you just ask the question and can answer it honestly for yourself, I think that's a good step in and of itself.
So we talked a lot about asynchronous work, synchronous work. What's the role of offsites and getting people together? What are some of the other things, if you were to kind of have like a top hits list, if you will, of
Mm-hmm.
things that you have implemented or you think are important in the practices of fully remote at Doist that other young fully remote companies should learn from? Are there a few things that have really worked well, or maybe you messed up in the early days and have gotten good at now that other organizations should really pay attention to?
Definitely. One of them is having some sort of central source of truth. We call it, a company handbook. Others call it a central source of truth or a documentation system, something like that. But we have over 1,200 pages of documentation in our company handbook that's accessible to everyone. And that started with writing a single page, one day, like 10 years ago. Just we need to document our core values, and then it just began from there. So one thing is having a company handbook or some sort of like central place where people can house documentation, and people can access that and answer questions, and you know, pose challenges to the way the company's approaching things. That's very important. But also just getting started. Like people hear that, they hear 1,200 pages, or they read the GitLab handbook that Darren and his team wrote, and you go, that seems so daunting. We'll never get there. You don't have to get there day one. You know, just having that piece of the infrastructure in place, and getting started is super important. And attached to that, I would say like the tools that you use, and the processes you use should really be optimized for this type of work. So like with every facet of how you're working as a company, you should kind of pressure test it and ask like, is this set up for today's way of working? You know, if you've transitioned from an office to a fully remote setup or a hybrid setup, like, is what we were doing in the office still applicable to the way that we're working today? Or is there perhaps a better tool or a better process that we should use? And so going through that exercise is really valuable as well.
So I imagine, I mean, one of the things that we see a lot is that hybrid organizations struggle with this topic a ton, right? And, it's one thing to grow up fully remote. As you mentioned, Doist from the earliest days thought about this as, a core part of the culture. How do we improve at this? And so there was no unlearning, if you will, of, okay, we were in the office full time. What does it mean to adjust? Most hybrid organizations, if I were to guess, it's probably 90% plus of hybrid organizations were full time in office organizations originally, and
Yeah.
now are hybrid organizations. And so, if you were to think about what you've learned over time doing this fully remote, and you're a hybrid organization trying to figure out, now I've got to balance synchronous and asynchronous work and think about when it makes sense to get together in person or not, or when do we meet or not. Any advice for hybrid leaders or managers, or even just hybrid team members that are trying to think through this? How do you start to be reflective, intentional around when you get together and don't, or when you meet and don't, so you can start to embed that new way of working more effectively?
That's an awesome question. I think the word that you used there, intentionality, is one that has to be used a lot in this whole conversation. Whether you're talking hybrid or or remote first, these are both fairly new operating models, and so we have a lot to learn. And again, applying old methods to new ways of working just probably isn't the recipe for success that many of those leaders are looking for. So yeah, I think it's extremely valuable to be intentional about this, and to think through, as I mentioned before, like every aspect of how you work, and see if it's built for this new type of working that we're seeing people involved in. The other thing I guess I would mention in alignment with that is that we don't have to accept the current reality. Like at Doist, for example, we were really focused on being asynchronous first, but we were using Slack, which is can be used asynchronously, but it also kind of lends itself to instant communication. It's sort of used as a chat tool. And so we found, this isn't really working for us. This is 6, 7 years ago. And we created our own tool. We created Twist. We built Twist for us, and that worked really well. Well, today you don't have to do that. There's so many teams out there operating in a hybrid or in a remote first world that you can find the tools and platforms that really serve your needs. So again, like exploring those options and realizing that these things need to be applied to a new way of working is extremely helpful, and it's available to you now. It wasn't just a few years ago.
Are there any other best practices that we haven't touched on that you say, okay, look, we can't wind this down, like we'd be remiss in finishing a conversation around Doist and fully remote work if we didn't touch on this topic and impart a little wisdom there?
Well, I think I did, coming back to that and your last question, like something that we could challenge hybrid leaders in particular to think through is, am I giving everyone on my team the same experience? Is there a sort of a location agnostic approach to work that we can apply here, so that the person working in the office every Tuesday is getting the same experience when they work from home on Wednesday, and the person that never comes into the office is getting that same experience that person that comes into the office on Tuesday is. And you probably can't do that 100%, but challenging yourself to do that and think through a location agnostic experience is I think something that's very valuable for us. We have a lot of people in Europe, for example. There's about 50% of the team is spread across the European time zones. And so those people could very easily get a much different experience than the people who are working in outlying time zones. But we work really intentionally to make sure that everyone's getting the same experience, not only for fairness purposes, but also for productivity purposes. It makes sure that everything that we're doing fits everyone perfectly. And that's been really helpful.
And how do you measure it? Is it through engagement surveys, pulses? Is just like a general sense of what's going on and the feedback that comes through the org? Yeah, I'm particularly curious about how you do this at 100 people, and
Mm-hmm.
then a lot of the more structured hybrid organizations. When I say structured hybrid, I mean, set a specific expectation on amount of time in office, maybe 2 days, 3 days, whatever it might be. Some of those organizations are quite large, tens of thousands,
Yeah.
hundreds of thousands of people. And so if you're trying to figure out what seems like a simple question, am I creating an equal experience, but across massive swaths of teams and people, et cetera, how do you get your finger on the pulse of that?
Yeah, I'm lucky I don't have to solve that problem because I admit that is quite a different animal to have to deal with when you're talking a small organization like us of 100 or some of the bigger ones out there that have tens of thousands. It is a completely different situation. In our case, we do regular employee engagement surveys, and we ask specific questions about the remote experience in that survey. Another thing that we've done is we've implemented a sort of like a social calendar that provides a lot of social activities of various types and degrees, some more purely social, some more work focused, but ways for people to connect throughout the year, because we found that we found that those engagement surveys were really, really positive around the time of retreats. And then during that 6 month lull in between, they would start to taper off a little bit. So
Mm.
providing something to kind of keep people connected throughout the year outside of the scope of their day-to-day activities really helped to improve those scores.
Makes a ton of sense, and we experience the same thing. Our organization is distributed. We're hybrid, but we're also employees' choice. We don't make people go into an office. They can choose how often they want to get together, and we find these spikes in how connected everybody feels around. We do 2 offsites a year, also every 6 months, and we think about, okay, what's the right type of activities every month, every 2 months between then, some synchronous,
Yeah.
some asynchronous, to create those connections so you can keep that feeling over the course of the year in between too.
Yeah, it's really valuable, and it can be extremely easy to organize. Like, again, just putting a little bit of intentionality into it, figuring out what your team likes. Like, don't the proverbial Zoom happy hour is nobody's favorite thing. So going a bit beyond that and getting creative with it can be a lot of fun. It pays dividends down the road with with some of the business metrics that we talked about before, and it makes working an enjoyable experience. I mean, a lot of people poke fun at remote work and, you could say like, oh, they're just robots sitting alone and lonely in their bedroom. You don't really have any human connection. You miss out on the friends. And I look at that and I look at the way we work. And I mean, I have friends around the world that I get to hang out with in amazing locations twice a year and meet up with virtually a few times a month, have incredibly interesting conversations. It's very fulfilling if it's done right. And so I think the organizations that are thinking about this very strategically and wanting to do remote or hybrid at a high level, they're investing in these kind of activities.
So, 2 final questions for you, Chase. And you've shared a ton of wisdom on this topic, and obviously have a lot of expertise in fully remote work and culture and connectedness. Who else do you read, listen to, really respect that? If folks that are listening are like, I want to learn more about this topic, and from others who are really good at this, who would you point them to?
Yeah, there's a ton of people. So I'm a total nerd for this stuff. I read a lot of the work that's put out there, whether they be articles or books, or attend the events, go to the conferences, things like that. So I'll plug a few people, but honestly, the list is very, very long. So one thing in particular is I've attended the Running Remote conference for many years now, and found that to be incredibly helpful. So for anybody interested in really going deeper on some of the things we talked about today, I think that can be a great starting point. If you really just want to dive in, and if you're not familiar with it, it's runningremote.com. They also have an awesome Slack community that's full of some really bright people sharing lots of best practices. So well worth the relatively small investment there. I follow a lot of remote thought leaders like Nick Bloom, for example, from Stanford, puts out some amazing stuff. Our mutual friend Darren Murph has been a big help to me over years and shared many insights with his community, particularly on LinkedIn. There's a lot more. Chris Dyer is another guy that I've followed for a long time. Sophie Wade. So these are all people that I've connected with now in person and online for many years, but they've put out books, they've done podcast interviews, they've written articles, done case studies. There's tons to dive into there.
Awesome. And then one final question for you, Chase. For folks that really enjoyed listening to you and learning more about your perspective, where would you send them to learn more about you and Doist and some of the things that you were sharing?
Yeah, so we have an incredible blog. It's on todoist.com/inspiration hub, and it's full of tons of practical tips about remote teamwork and distributed workforce and things like that. So I would definitely send people there. I also talk a lot about this specifically on my LinkedIn. So I would suggest connecting with me there. And yeah, if you do that, and if anybody's listening and wants to reach out and ask any questions about anything we talked over today, I'm happy to do that, or connect them to other people in my network who are experts in their individual fields.
Awesome. Well, Chase, I learned a lot. I think this is fantastic and great to cover. And particularly, I love the conversation around intentionality, around synchronous versus asynchronous work, how you think about meetings, how you think about the role of offsites and the timing of it. So thank you for getting into all the specifics and really helping paint a picture and a clear roadmap for organizations, whether they be fully remote or hybrid, in terms of what are some of the best practices and how do you start to get better at some of this stuff. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. It's some really some good questions, some challenging ones to think through, and it's a lot of fun. This whole transition can be a really exciting one for the people that embrace it and want to adopt new ways of working. And so, always happy to chat through it. Thank you.
Well said. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please also consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that helps other listeners find the podcast. For more FlexIndex content, including past episodes, our FlexIndex newsletter, and monthly research reports, visit flex.scoopforwork.com. See you next time.